My name's Sarah Sands. I'm chairing this very great Bright Blue event in partnership with Centenary Action Group this morning. In case you don't know, the Bright Blue is an independent think tank, pressure group for liberal conservatism. We're going to have a relaunch autumn, so look out for that. Our research focuses on social, educational, environmental and economic policy. So today's debate seems to be central to that. Also, can I just say that Bright Blue has launched a new magazine for this party conference, examine the impact of COVID-19 on our family and social lives. That includes an interview with Treasury Minister Jessie Norman. So you can read this online or at our website, blue.org. If people are going to tweet, please do hashtag blue at hashtag CPC20 and to follow at We Are Bright Blue and at Centenary Action. We're going to this morning again 5 minutes about some of the crucial questions on how to introduce diversity in the conservative way, or not necessarily that, but how to do successfully in politics. And so we're going to have individual speakers for 5 minutes, and then we're going to have questions and answers from the audience. So that I hope I'm going to receive on this some questions from you during that time. The kind of questions that we will be looking at are: why are there still fewer women as MPs and ministers? Why do we need more diversity in politics? And reforms are needed to candidate application and selection process. So it's sort of why and it's how. And now to introduce you to our, we have Caroline Nokes, who's the chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, former Minister for Immigration from 2018, and elected as MP for Romsey and Southampton North in 2010. Anita Boateng, Senior Director at FTI Consulting, and she was former Special Advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister. Kanwal is the Chair of the Conservative Diversity Project, was the Conservative Unionist Party candidate in Slough in the 2019 election, and Dr. Helen Pankhurst is the convener of the Centenary Action Group. She's also currently CARE's International Senior Advisor in the UK and Ethiopia, and of course does have a name for historical resonance for this debate. As I say, I'm the chair of Bright Blue. I was a former editor of the Evening Standard, editor of the Today programme, and now very, very happy to take up this new role. So if we could start by going to Caroline Nokes for her 5 minutes. I'm going to be strict on how do we introduce more diversity into politics.
Thank you, Sarah, and great to be here this morning and have the opportunity to talk about this to all of those viewers that we have, and I hope that my broadband holds out this morning. So I think there are a number of challenges, and it's really obvious to see that we are still in a position where there are too few women MPs altogether, but particularly Conservative women MPs. And I can remember going into the 2019 election absolutely devastated that I thought we were going to lose some really, really great women. I would identify people like Nicky Morgan, Seema Kennedy, Anne Milton, Amber Rudd. The list is really long, and I was worried that we wouldn't be replacing them. Now, the reality is we did, and we have some fantastic new female colleagues who come on board and are really making their mark in Parliament, but there are challenges about how you keep them. What we saw in 2019 was a lot of people, a lot of women, who I would argue were still early in their career, standing down. Nicky Morgan in particular cited the pressures of social media, the abuse that MPs were taking, but there were more structural problems as well. And Parliament is still not a great place to be a woman. I can remember having been made a minister way back in 2016, having colleagues tell me to my face that I only got the job because I had tits. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that at the conference this early in the morning, but that's the reality. They were prepared to say that to my face. So what on earth were they saying behind my back? Truly terrifying. But it really does go right back to the beginning. So if we have too many men in Parliament, and as a result we have too few women making it as minister, then inevitably you're going to have a challenge around those women seeing positive role models, younger women wanting to come in and be part of the system, and our candidate selection process is still not transparent enough. We know who gets to stand in elections. What we don't know is who doesn't get to stand, who applies in the first place. And my party has been worse than all the others at being prepared to sign up to Section 106 of the Act, being prepared to give information about who it is that's applying to stand in the first place. That's not ideal, and I think it's time that we change that. And that we also had much more positive and proactive mentoring to make sure all those great women who were elected in 2019 stay and can see a positive career path. To make sure that those women who didn't get selected to stand for a seat in 2019 get a chance next time. And of course, to make sure that at every level, whether it be London Assembly, Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, whether it be local councils, we encourage and foster women on the journey to becoming parliamentarians. And why? Well, I think it's really straightforward. When you have a more diverse group of people in the room making decisions, you get better decisions. I would always highlight, and I've said this in the House of Commons and I've said this in the media, that actually at the moment one of the issues that keeps getting overlooked is childcare. Now, if we are not taking into account the challenges of working parents, particularly women, when it comes to making sure that they can continue their careers in the most difficult circumstances, nobody would have ever imagined a 6 months like we've just had, then the real challenge is how can we make sure that their concerns, their worries about how they will afford childcare, whether it will be available, what's happened to their childcare provider over the last 6 months, I don't see them being addressed by government. And those are real questions, real challenges that people are facing every single day. I always tell people I am late to this issue, and I will stick my hand up and confess to that. And the reason why? Well, I think I assumed my mother had fought battles in the 1970s so that I wouldn't have to now. And the thing that makes me angry is that I'm still having to fight now so that my daughter isn't facing the same challenges in 5, 10 years' time, or even now. So basically it's about making sure that we have a new generation of women able to step up, wanting to step up. I think we have to make playing your part in public life an attractive and appealing thing to do, to show people that they can make a real difference, that they can be part of something that matters, that is serious, and will make the world and indeed the country a better place going forward. So I hope that's helpful. And in the gap, I will try and put a headset on and sort out my microphone problems.
I wonder if Sarah's frozen.
Anita, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I think I better get started, given that there might be some connectivity issues today. Now, obviously, I can't tell if you can't hear me, so I will keep talking unless someone interrupts me. So thinking about this question, and actually entirely coincidentally, I watched a very English scandal on the BBC this weekend. And for those of you who don't know, it's a sort of dramatised account of the scandal involving Jeremy Thorpe in the 1970s. And it is astonishing for several reasons. But I was really struck by how kind of pale, expected, but exceptionally male politics was, and Parliament was, just 50 years ago. So I suspect I might be the optimist of the group. And the first thing I want to acknowledge is that the challenge of diversity in Parliament is not unique to it. So I've worked in politics my entire adult life. My first job after university was working in Parliament in a team that was roughly 35% female. I worked in political television on Question Time, and I was the only woman in the editorial team. I worked as a special advisor, and as far as I'm aware, I'm the only black woman to have been a Tory SPAD, and female representation was ranged between maybe 25%, maybe as high as 38, 39 under David Cameron. And now I'm an elected councillor, which is maybe in a group that's about 30% female. So as you can tell, representation in Parliament, which is at around 34% now, is not even at the lower end of that scale. And so for me, like, Parliament isn't doing as badly relative to some of those other groups, because I think that there is a successful, visible diversity in the party that is making a difference. And we know the examples: two female prime ministers, Saeeda Varsi, Priti Patel. And I personally hear less and less often the suggestion that to increase diversity in Parliament would be to have a lower quality of MPs. I think that's something I did hear, and I used to work as a special advisor to the party chairman. But I think I'm hearing that less, and maybe that's in part due to disillusionment with politicians in general, but I like to think it's in part due to some excellence in the Conservative Party. And just specifically on this point around identity, and you know, you're making this about identity politics, I think this argument is actually exactly the opposite. I think having more women, having more ethnic minorities, having a diversity of accents, of class backgrounds, it in fact means people are more likely to believe that your gender or your race or whatever isn't the thing that determines your fitness for leadership. And I think the decisions therefore are more likely to be based on the things that really matter and not those other factors. So for me, in terms of realising that ambition, I think Caroline has spoken to what it's like to be an MP, and I can't speak to that. But I think this pipeline issue is something that I'm really increasingly engaged in. And as I said, I was an advisor to the party chairman, Brandon Lewis, and I definitely don't think the concern was about whether there were excellent female candidates in the country. And so for me, the first solution to tackle that pipeline problem is resource. When you're talking about diversity of really any kind, gender, race, class, it does come back to resources often. And the cost of standing for Parliament or becoming a local councillor can rule out large sections of society. And women, partly because of gender pay, exploitations of caregiving, childcare, they're encouraged to take fewer of these financial risks. And I know the Conservative Party has a kind of six-figure pot that it uses to support parliamentary candidates. And I want schemes like that to continue, but also for them to become much more ambitious. And I do think people knowing about that kind of support and for those things to be really extensive could really make a difference in encouraging people to think that it's not going to be a huge financial risk to attempt to become a member of Parliament. And the second thing that I think is undeniable, and Caroline's just touched on, is abuse. And I mean, we all agree the level and nature of abuse levelled at female politicians is of an entirely different order. And Twitter definitely isn't the country, and it's one social media platform, but it's the one where political debate is. And I know, and I'm sure everyone on this panel knows, a number of female politicians that don't really engage in the platform for that reason. And I really don't have a lot of positive ways that can be tackled beyond, you know, Twitter doing what it needs to do to really foster a culture of less abuse. And the only other positive thing I can say about that really is that the LSE did some recent research that found that abuse towards politicians has actually gone down during the pandemic. So maybe on the other side of this, we will find a more compassionate and less personally vitriolic politics. And just to conclude there, I think I mean, it hasn't been 100 years since women and men gained the vote on equal footing. And it's definitely wrong to just assume that progress happens in only one direction. And I think a lot of us on this call will attest to that. But I guess I am the optimist in terms of thinking that the direction the party is going in is the right one. I just think that specifically around pipeline, if we can really up the level of support and encourage more people from different backgrounds to stand and do our part in fostering kind of politics, that 2024 will see us go further in the right direction. I'm not sure if Sarah's back, so who's next?
Kanwal.
Yeah, I think I'll take it from there, Anita. Very well said. I'm going to talk about my journey, which is very interesting, actually, and it's just an example of how diversity is sort of, shaped into the whole conservative party dimension, etc. for myself. So, after having married a Brit and with aspirations and dreams, I moved to the UK 9 years ago and made this great country my home. In 2016, I decided to join the world of politics and join the Conservative Party. In 2019, I stood as their parliamentary candidate from Slough. Now, the interesting thing is that there is no other country in the world, in my opinion, which offers an immigrant a chance to stand for public office in such a short span of time. Britain does, and I'm proud of that. Now, the Conservative Party is truly a party of all. I'm an example of that. Today, we have more BAME MPs in cabinet than any other party has ever done. We are the party that has given the nation not one, but two prime ministers, women prime ministers. But we have a long way to go. Although there are more women MPs than ever before, we still make only about 25% of the total 365 MPs when it comes to women. We have more MPs from diverse backgrounds than we had in 2017. But they're still at 6%, which is an underrepresentation by 100%. And when it comes to ethnicities, that's about ethnicities. And when it comes to disabilities, we are grossly underrepresented. It's just at 1%. Now, why do we need a diverse and inclusive parliament? The most annoying thing is when people say diversity is for the left. No, it isn't. It isn't, absolutely not. Inclusion and diversity is important, number one, for representation. As we all know, having a House of Commons, the composition of which better reflects a wider society, adds legitimacy to the democratic process and leads to better policy making. It also enables Parliament to make decisions and provide scrutiny which better represents the experiences, needs, and views of the population it serves. The second thing is positive optics. A more diverse parliament offers a greater proportion of the electorate a sense of belonging and inclusion. It is a reminder that your gender, your religion, your race, your background, your sexuality shouldn't be a limitation in your value or your ability to contribute to the society. Number three, democratic. Number three, a greater diversity of elected representatives is a significant step towards a healthier democracy. Simply having people at the table with different backgrounds and perspectives should help to facilitate a more dynamic and productive conversation. Fourth, very important thing is engagement. The diversity visible in Parliament could help to create a more open and inclusive space for marginalized groups to engage with the political system by creating role models. And creating role models is such a great thing to do. This increase in visible diversity amongst the MPs can act as a catalyst, enabling further engagement from previously underrepresented groups. Finally, progress. Britain is a modern, successful, forward-thinking nation. Developing countries like India have passed the Women's Reservation Bill, I don't know if many of you know that, which reserves in some Indian states 50% of seats in the panchayat. And panchayat is what we call the local councils here. So here in Britain, we must take the tangible steps to narrow the gap, walk the talk. Now, what we need are honest, deliberate efforts by all parties, so we have true representation of ethnicities, abilities, genders, orientations, classes, and ages. And I and the Conservative Diversity Project are very happy to play our role in achieving this. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kanwal. I came back for the end of that. I'm sorry that it's been so sort of ropey my end. So I'm going to introduce Helen Pankhurst from the Centenary Action Group with great pleasure. And then I'm going to leave Ryan to do the questions because I think it's going to work better that way. So Helen, over to you.
Great, thank you. So as I was introduced by Sarah from the beginning, you know, the issue of representation and diversity in Parliament is very close to my heart, my lineage, my background. And, you know, as Caroline initially said, you know, she was hoping that her mother's generation had resolved these issues. In my case, it was my grandmother and great-grandmother, and still we're on that journey. In 2018, I convened the Centenary Action Group, 2018 being the centenary of when some women got the vote. And I felt that it was our watch. Where were we? We knew that we were not there yet. And between 2018, that first centenary, and 2028, the equal franchise centenary, it seemed to me that we needed to push the needle as much as possible. So we came together, organizations, individuals, those directly involved in politics, civil society representatives, academics, to say, what do we need to do? What are the obstacles? And we broke it down into 3 themes. One, looking at the structural issues of the whole political system. Another, looking at violence, which came up, violence and abuse came up very, very quickly as both a problem in terms of women standing, but also in staying. The point also made by Caroline earlier. And then finally, the economic ones, the issue of economic constraints, which Anita also highlighted. So those were the sub-themes we started to look at. And this very diverse group of people included conservative women in both houses, both in the House of Lords and in the Commons, and also in other backgrounds. And I would like to do a shout out to them, because it's very easy to think and plan cross-party work. But when you are the party in power, it's that much harder, I think, to reach out. And yet it's that much more important that you do, because you have a bit more power and influence. So I'd like to shout out to Maria Miller, Anne Jenkins, Virginia Crosby, Theo Clark, Fleur Glutler, Charlotte Kero-Polk in particular, as ones who've really engaged with us on some of these issues. And also for those of you on the panel here, really important that we hear your voices. Tomorrow, we are launching this report. I hope you can see it. So it's The Data Drives Diversity, a simple guide towards more transparent politics. And this research is looking at the issue of Section 106 of the Equality Act. Now, the Equality Act stated that both at a national and at a local level, parties should provide data and keep that data on candidates' protected characteristics. That's there, but Section 106 of the Act says that government should mandate all parties to collect and publish this data. And it's critical that we have this data, because it's this data, sorry about my hair problem issue, it's this data that would provide that transparency, and therefore we get better knowledge of where the bottlenecks are. And based on that, we could change things. So absolutely critical that Section 106 of the Equalities Act is enacted. It's 10 years since that Equality Act was came into fruition, and we're celebrating the 10 years, the decade. But it's this act that this Conservative government needs to push forward. It's pivotal, it's symbolic, it's really important. The issues about why have already been mentioned, why we need diversity. I don't want to stress that too much. But to say, this is my last point really, that why the Conservative Party? And the Conservative Party because 1918, that first symbolic act, was a coalition party with actually majority of Conservatives. 1920 Act, the other critical act that brought equal franchise, Conservative Party. We've already heard mention of the 2 prime ministers as being women. Although issues of feminism and moving issues of diversity are often seen to belong to the left, it is the right in power now that has that ability to make another symbolically really important step. enacting 106. So please support us with this campaign. You can find more information on Centenary Action Group website. And now is the time. It's an important time prior to the next election in 2024. So please do focus on this one symbolic moment when we can change something. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. I heard all that beautifully. I don't know what the sort of conspiracy is that that the internet seemed to crash out for when women were talking before that, but I think we've got the themes, and I think that that sense, that exciting sense that this is ground that that your party can seize is really interesting. That still there's a slight assumption that feminism belongs to the left. And I think that idea that Helen was just talking about, that that there's a counter narrative to that, and that there's maybe something about the sort of boldness of what you can do and the risk that you're prepared to take. We've got some questions coming in, and they're interesting because they talk, I think, to the how as much as the why. I think that there seems to be a general agreement that diversity produces better politics, and that you suffer without it. But the how you bring women in, and how you get diversity without discrimination and so on, still seems to be a big question. So I've got one question from Judith Clark, and which is an interesting one. Is there age discrimination in selecting women as potential candidates? Might 70 be the new 40, or is this not going to happen? Should age be a barrier? Perhaps if I go to Caroline on that first.
No, of course it shouldn't be a barrier. I can think of some great female colleagues who first came into Parliament when they were significantly older than I am now. I at so I don't think age should be a barrier. I think in some instances it is. And we've had some brilliant, I have to say, absolutely brilliant new young female MPs elected at the last election. And I would point at Sarah Brickcliffe, Nicola Richards, Deanna Davison, who have been absolutely great and are clearly going to have fabulous careers if we can keep them. And I was asked last week in a Zoom event whether I thought which one of those I would pick to be the first cabinet minister. And I said, look, I'm more interested in those three all hanging around, having a long parliamentary career. There's a statistic that tells us that female MPs are likely to serve a full term less on average than their male counterparts. So I think you can get elected at any age. So Dennis Skinner was still MP by the 80s. I'm not sure that is ideal. But I think it's important that you have a breadth of experience. So as well as our brilliant 20-somethings, you need 30, 40, 50, 60-somethings as well. And we had some examples of people in our party who are playing a fantastic role well into their 70s.
Thank you. Perhaps just on Anita, if I could pick on that, is there a sort of generational difference in how you attract women? We've talked about sort of pipeline, but do you recruit in different ways? So the kind of women who might come when they're older in different circumstances with different challenges. What do you think, Anita? Do you think that we need a different kind of recruitment to make everyone feel welcome?
I think that's a really good question. And the thing I'm struck by as a local councillor is I get a lot of angry emails from men saying, this local area isn't good enough, what are you going to do about it, that kind of thing. And the kinds of emails that I get from women about similar issues are, I was thinking of starting like a litter picking group, or I was concerned about this, like, can you help me do it? And I'm getting that from women who are in their 20s and 30s, and that's the group that I know best. And so my feeling is they're just as interested in kind of community action or in what they, small p politics. And maybe if they were asked if they cared about politics more generally, they might be a bit like, not sure if I would categorize myself that way. And so I think this ask her to stand thing was almost less about broad brush initiatives, and much more about how we capture some of the like enthusiasm and energy that I see at a local level and bring it into politics. And likewise, my experience of talking to women starting out in Parliament, etc., is how do we get them to think of themselves as more than what they're currently doing, and to raise kind of horizons and say, well, actually, you're good enough doing this, and you could do so much more with it. So from my part, I think recruiting women in their 20s and 30s is not about finding new people to bring into politics, because a lot of them are in politics. It's getting them to think about like doing it forever. And I think so many of them would be fantastic if that were the case.
That is interesting. Yes, Kanwal, we talked about losing women somehow, which actually is a general problem. How do you think that you keep women without them becoming disillusioned or just going somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the first question, in fact, to do with age discrimination, when we founded the Conservative Diversity Project as well, it was very important that we talk about diversity and encourage and foster diversity in the real sense of the word. And that included women from all age groups, whether you're 20s or you're 60s or 70s, if you've got the caliber, if you've got the talent, if you're interested in politics, then you must stand and represent your area and your communities, etc., etc. So age should not be an issue. I mean, we have representation in Parliament from Dina Davison, who's one of the youngest parliamentarians. She's just about 25. And then on the other hand, we've got people like Theresa May, and we've got Cheryl Gillen, who's my local MP, slightly older ladies, but absolutely adding value to the whole system and to the Parliament as well, and the big governance. So that's what it is. Now, losing women, engagement is very important. I mean, there are three things which are important here. One is women have far less time than men do, and hence their engagement in politics is slightly limited, whether it's to do with families or whether it's to do with the quality of jobs that they do, or the time, the balancing of the time between work and work-life balance, as they say. So that is something that we need to really address. I mean, again, CDP is something that, and as the chair of the CWO Diversity as well, one thing that we really encourage is that we have events at variety of times, afternoons, evenings, so that women can attend more and more events and engage with us. The second is funding. Somebody had already mentioned, I mean, sadly, the quality of jobs that women seem to be doing in the wider sort of society is that, I mean, they don't make as much money, sadly, as much as it seems the men do in a wide variety of jobs. And then that, sort of funding them and then funding a political life as well, or a political career, is very challenging. So, again, diversity funding is something that we are really pushing and promoting as in the CDP as well. So that's something, obviously, and training and keeping them engaged is how we will attract more and more women, is what I think.
Thank you. So another question here from Anushka Sharma, and it is, we need to think about equity as much as equality, but it's dynamic and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach if we're truly going to attract diverse talent. So, Helen, how do you get women to feel that they've got a stake in politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to look at the different constraints and make it a nicer, more favourable place to be in. Quite frankly, there's so many structural obstacles at the moment for any age range. So, we talked a bit about the elderly. What about those with children? The whole issue. I mean, can you believe that in the 21st century, Parliament does not have maternity cover as a standard for any woman MP who goes on leave? So we've had a few examples, but it's not a standard. I mean, for me, that's just really in the 21st century. So I think there's a whole set of things like this that need to change. However, on the positive side, this engagement with politics, understanding that there's a major problem. We've seen how COVID impacts different types of people in different ways, and how the system hasn't really acknowledged or understood that. It's always been slightly slow on a number of issues. So unless we engage from all ages, from all backgrounds, we're perpetuating the problems, and it's on our watch. We can't afford to say, let the next generation do this.
Thank you so much. Caroline, perhaps one for you. This is from James Fisk. Is there a place for all women shortlists in ensuring representation?
Sorry, I was on mute. Away from supporting all women shortlists, I think it's important that you have balanced shortlists so that you have 50-50 men. I think that helps. But I'm not a huge fan of all women shortlists. I'll confess to that.
How do the rest of the panel feel? Anita, all women shortlists?
I've got to say I agree with Caroline. So I've seen a number of selections take place, and I don't think the problem is that women can't compete. And I have seen so many exceptional women go out and do really well and get selected. That doesn't make me think that that is where the kind of crunch pressure point is. And I do think it's difficult to just get the first step in terms of getting involved in your local association. I would say there's more of probably a barrier there. And also the things you talked about, which is like actually the process of running for Parliament, which can be a very difficult process. So I'm more concerned about those two areas, and particularly around selections.
Kanwal? Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. So it's a very complex issue. The fact of the matter is that we need to have a robust political strategy. Although I'm not a big fan of these A lists. However, I mean, the figures and the numbers, I mean, I've got a financial background. So, I look at the data, and obviously Helen's been talking about how sort of data drives diversity. And you look at the data and see the staggering figures, and you're like, big steps and tangible steps is the way to go forward. I mean, otherwise we could just talk the talk, and, it's going to take another generation before we have 50% of Parliament as women. So, I mean, again, when I talk about staggering figures, the Conservative Party selection in 2019 had about 70% of seats were men. I mean, that's staggering. Only 30% were women. What is it that you do? There has to be a hybrid model when you take the help from the centre, for example, CCHQ, then obviously you have the associations and you have the wider public. But it has to be something which is more than just waiting for things to happen. So, although I'm not a fan of A-list, but mandating and sort of directing and managing the situation is something that I would really recommend.
So you would intervene in who the candidates are, or what kind of intervention?
I mean, so for example, I mean, when I say mandate, I'm just thinking, the centre obviously sort of when the selections are happening, works closely with the association, gives a long list, says this, and it's happened in the party as well, gives a long list, says these are the recommended sort of, candidates that we have. Then obviously the association plays a role and has the short list, and then the wider public will choose their candidate. So that's the hybrid model that I'm talking about. So obviously you can't sort of upset the apple cart, and you can't have the association saying, it's all centered and it's gone away. The autonomy is not with us, and that's not the way, things should be. So that's what I'm saying. It's very complex. But like I said, the centre has to play a vital role, have the long list ready. Then the associations have a short list, and then the wider public chooses the candidate.
Helen, you said this can't wait for another generation. Would all that kind of intervention in selection make a difference?
So in this report, we have an example of 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 constituencies where not a single female candidate has been brought forward in all 3 general elections. So 2015, 2017, 2019, Bosworth, Bracknell, West Aberdeenshire, North East Hampshire. I could list them all, I won't. But the point is that unless we put a spotlight on the problem, nothing will change. I personally believe that all-female shortlist would be a quicker way of us getting there. But I understand that is not right now what a lot of the Conservative Party feel is the right strategy. What the Conservative Party is interested in and has done to some extent is collect some data. It's not done so consistently, and it's not mandated, and it has the power to do so. It's not mandated all parties to do that. If we get the data from all parties for all constituencies by male, female, BAME and disability, then immediately we have the information. We have the information to say, here's a problem, what are we going to do about it? And it's a very targeted, it's a very equitable, it's a very just way. It's a non-controversial way because parties are already doing this. The other parties have also indicated in their election manifesto that they were interested in this. So it's a no-brainer. Let's start with that. And if that doesn't work, then fine. But this party, this government can do it. It must do it.
So Caroline, on that point, that you've got your data, you recognise the problem, but what do? Do you have a quota system, which was something they tried at the BBC, and because just to stop the status quo asserting itself in the way that it will if you don't? Are there sort of specific measures that you think would work?
So I think you're fundamentally, you have to attract women to stand in the first place. You have to attract to apply for the candidates list. We know that only stands at around 25% of all the candidates who apply to go on the list are women. So what's deterring them? And I think some of the things deterring them are the general standing of politicians, the abuse they get in the media, the challenges, the moving away from your family, spending half the week in London, half the week at home. That's difficult for anyone. So for parents. And I'm always very keen to emphasise that. It's parents, it's not just mothers. But I think it has to be about finding all of those mechanisms that make it easy for people to stand. So we've heard a bit from Anita and Kanwal about candidates being given financial support. I know I was really, really lucky. If my dad had not funded my life for years, to be brutally honest, then I wouldn't be an MP now because I wouldn't be able to. And I watched him through thick and thin, convince me in 2005 when I just lost by 125 votes that I had another 5 years left in me. And it's hugely challenging financially. Lots of career opportunities that I passed up on because I was determined to win the Romsey and Southampton North seat for the Conservatives. But a really, really tough gig.
Yeah. Can I just come in quickly, Sarah, on this question around women's shortlists and data. So I was a special advisor to the party chairman when we brought in kind of publication kind of annually of like the numbers for people, you know, the stats that we do publish, which Conservative Party publishes, which is not as extensive as other parties. I think that's completely a given. I guess the one thing I would say that also really matters is kind of how selections are done. So I think you'll notice that with the Conservative Party, the number of people from diverse backgrounds in safe seats is really quite increased. And I think that really matters because that's not about how you in the Labour system essentially game it so that it's about a kind of one-to-one sense of representation. If you're in an ethnic area, then you have an ethnic MP, or that actually you're getting women selected into areas where they're not likely to actually become MPs because they are, you know, very marginal or Conservative seats. So I think that the numbers in themselves tell one story. I also would say that factoring in the kinds of seats where we think there's going to be, all goes well, Conservative MPs for a significant amount of time also makes a significant difference. And I think that also makes a difference to Caroline's point around how you juggle the challenges of becoming a member of parliament. And I think most MPs would say an intensely marginal seat and the pressures and the expectations on you when you're in that position versus a more safe seat does make a material difference to how you experience becoming an MP and make the most of those opportunities.
Yeah. So you can sort of ease the path. I've got a question from Mia Rosselli, and it's women are less likely from a young age to say they understand or are interested in politics. How can we change that? Perhaps Helen.
Look at the whole story of the suffragettes. I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah. I handed that to you. Yeah.
The colourfulness, the verve, the thinking that went into that campaign, just the extraordinary story of resilience. Also, the conflicts, the differences of opinions. There's so much there, and I'm so glad to see so many youngsters studying that because I think there's so much that you can learn from that. I just wanted to add, if I may, to go back a tiny bit on a couple of points. The issue of violence has come up a lot, violence and harassment. And there's some important work that's going on at the moment. So, for example, Glitch, a shout out for the work that Glitch is doing to raise awareness about this and to support candidates and women thinking of standing around this whole issue. You know, training on how to address harassment, online harassment in particular. And then the other thing that I think can change things, and is in terms of the point that Caroline made about home life balance, etc., is what happens going forward with the hybrid parliament. We know that the technology is slightly problematic. We know that there's a power base still as to who's speaking and who's not, who's in the chambers and who isn't. All sorts of issues that we need to learn about, but potentially there's some benefits about this whole hybrid parliament going forward that would address the concerns and difficulties of parents in particular, but also carers, etc. And that could widen the opportunity for more people to get involved who otherwise would just say no way.
That's interesting. And Kanwal, that we talked a bit about online abuse then. I mean, how big a part does it play, do you think, in putting off women, and what can be done? You've talked about conversations with Twitter, but are there any specific sort of policy or legislative ideas or solutions?
Yeah, I mean, social media abuse for women in particular is rampant. I mean, when I stood from Slough in 2019, it was massive. It was 4 months of abuse every day, just waking up to Facebook and Twitter with personal attacks, being compared to terrorist groups, to being funded by the Indian government, and all sorts of things which will break you down. And, you literally cry on your husband's shoulder and say, this is not for me, and this is taking my time away from the kids, and I can't do this anymore. But I mean, the only advice that I'd like to give to the women is just stay strong. I mean, politics, for that matter, is not an easy game. I mean, even though for anyone else, I mean, for women as much as men, it is just not an easy thing to do. Public life is not an easy thing to do. There's constant scrutiny. People are watching you all the time. Anything you say and do is judged. You cannot fully please all the people all the time, as they say. So, I mean, just hold your horses. Just stand your ground. Believe in the things that you believe in, and say it, and just fight an honest fight. That's what I did. Policy-wise, I mean, to run a campaign, I guess you just have a campaign manager who runs your social media as well, and you don't get involved into day-to-day abuse, which then affects your entire mental sort of structure and breaks you down. And otherwise, I mean, you just have to take it and then fight it out, and then just do it. I mean, any form of public life is very challenging, and this will be new.
Caroline, how did you develop a resilience to all this?
So the Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions is your friend. I said that because the morning after I became Immigration Minister, I had breakfast with Therese Coffey, who I think at the time, let's say she was at DEFRA, and I handed her my phone and she turned notifications off. And that made my life a million times easier. The moral of this story is block and mute are your friends. Don't read it. And Twitter is an echo chamber of people who are talking to themselves. Every time I appear on the media, the first comment that anyone will put on Twitter about it is that I'm fat and stupid. And you know what? I don't care. And that's the reality. The Caroline Nokes of 10 years ago would have cared. She'd have got upset. She would have been incredibly thin-skinned about it. Sadly, the Caroline Nokes of 2020 is an absolute rhinoceros. I don't care.
Very good. I've got a question for Mia Rosselli, but does the media play a part in making politics a difficult place for women? We've talked about social media, but Anita, you have experience in mainstream media. How does that work? Is there, because you can't turn that off, and are women engaging in the right way, do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, I'm fascinated by all these surveys that show that women think they care less about politics, or they engage less in politics. And I slightly wonder if that's a victim of people thinking, oh, well, I don't know enough about this to be like, well, I'm interested in politics. And I think there's some interesting studies that show that men tend to assume a lot more of their own competence and awareness of issues than is perhaps the case. And so I'm not sure I buy the idea that women are less interested in politics in any way. On the question of media, I mean, so I commentate about politics every now and again, and I have never had an email from a woman offering me unsolicited advice or views on my performance. I have had many from men. And so I think, yeah, you're right. And what I was saying at the beginning was this point around, this is not about Parliament, and it's not even really about politics. It is about public life. And so I think, especially the issues around age, of women on television, like these are things that are so much wider than Parliament. And I think it's important for us to talk about Parliament because I think it says a lot about how we see ourselves as a nation. But I do completely agree that the media has two roles: A, in who it puts on, and B, in how we talk about politics, which in this country is very much about personality and individuals and strife, and slightly less about policy and issues and data and all the other ways that you can assess the effectiveness of governance. So I think all of those factors do play a part. And I think it's important almost not to sort of see that and go, well, it's all a bit too hard, but look at the piecemeal ways in which you can make a difference. And I used to work in Question Time. The number of women who talk about politics that we beg to go on the show that would say there is absolutely no way. And that's not just about abuse, but that was a huge part, but also about, oh no, I'm not sure if I would really, know enough about this. And then
it is that difference. I mean, you mentioned Helen earlier, I think Anne Jenkins in your list of women who was someone who would never come onto the Today programme. She just said, oh, it's too daunting. And to talk about the actual work that she did. And that she was, a frontline, and the number of times you would, ask a woman to come on and she'd say, I don't know enough about it, even if it was her, absolute kind of mastered subject, and the men would just go, yeah, of course, And I think plus all the things that you were talking about of just trying to sort of ease the path of making it more practical. Sometimes in the morning it's more difficult for women are doing more things and that kind of stuff. So it is interesting, all those sort of details of obstacles, isn't it? And what the responsibility is of organisations apart from politics. We just look at. We've got one more, actually, going back to shortlist. We've got one from Lauren Benny that says, but why are women shortlists frowned upon when all men shortlists often concede? Do you think you should intervene if there is an all men shortlist? Helen, you talked about some of those on that data.
I mean, personally, I think we do. But the first step is let's get the data. Let's get the data, be able to see it. I think by the very fact that you're getting the data, things change immediately because you're shining the problem, you're seeing the problem. So that as a simple, non-controversial step, it just needs to be enacted. The act is there. It just needs, that final push, and then you identify where the problem is and you can do things about it. And I think those involved there in those constituencies would feel uncomfortable about some of what it shows up and would start acting.
Does that, Caroline, sort of name and shame? Does that, or give data and shame? Is that a good way to put it?
I think it does shine a light on it. And I think that's important. And we know, and I'm sorry, I should have come on with the list of them. We know that there were some constituencies which did have all women shortlists through merit. There was no positive action to do it. They just picked the final four that they wanted to interview, and they all happened to be women. However, it is wrong that there should be any excuse for hiding away from the data. So let us have the information. Let us see where there might or might not be issues. And I'm sure there are constituencies up and down the country that have been really diligent making sure that they have balanced shortlists. But I think we need to see the stats to know.
Yeah. I mean, and to add to that, actually, I mean, like Helen just saying, how we can get more women in politics, or Parliament for that matter, is again, and the numbers and data that Helen's talking about. I mean, when you look at the figures again, I mean, 76% of the men who stood in 2019, I'm talking about my party, were elected. And only 24% of women were elected. So I'm just saying, using your safe seats properly as well. I mean, give women the equal footing of getting those safe seats. Or, I mean, for BAME candidates, it was even worse. I mean, there was only 6% of BAME candidates who stood in elections won. So that means only fairly, that is the amount of safe seats that they got. So just using your safe seats well is another important thing, and that will come with this data that we're talking about, that we have it right in front of us, transparent, we know the numbers, and that's all that matters.
That's great. So one last question. I think we're coming up to 11:30, and that's from Jennifer Ramsey about how can we encourage women to take up more prominent roles. So we've talked about how to get them in. One thing is some of this may be out of your hands. I guess once you'll get to sort of government cabinet level, why aren't there more women? Back to Amber Rudd's sort of original question on this of why aren't there more women in the cabinet, and would it make a big difference to some of the issues that the government's facing if there were women involved? Caroline?
I think there needs to be more women in cabinet. We saw back in the spring, the Quad, all male, we saw some pretty ropey decisions for women. I've said that very publicly. I think my committee said that. I think the reality is we need to have more women in Parliament in order for there to be a bigger field of women from whom to choose to put into cabinet.
Anita, your thoughts?
I mean, I entirely agree with Caroline. That is exactly it. And I think that's why we keep going back to this pipeline issue. I also think that part of what is changing in our society is a sense of what we think as individuals and as a fairly diverse group we can achieve. And I think that that is something that takes a long time, and representation helps to build that sense that there isn't a type of person that is perfect for any particular job. And if you have the passion for it, go for it. And so I think we will see, and I think we're increasingly seeing more people interested in engaging in politics at all sorts of levels. It's what are the practical obstacles that we've just talked about that can actually be introduced to really accelerate that progress.
Kanwal, do you want to nominate anyone you think that should be in the cabinet that isn't?
Caroline is wonderful. She's absolutely wonderful. I mean,
job well there. Yeah.
Apart from the fact that she would make a great cabinet minister, I mean, to be honest, I'm a big fan of the cabinet right now. I mean, it's diverse. It's one of the most diverse cabinets that we've ever had. I mean, look at there's Soela, there's Preeti, there's the exchequer, Rishi, sorry, I forget his name. So, it's just absolutely wonderful to see that. So we are going in the right direction. It's just that, like I keep saying, it has to be more deliberate now, and let's just be more robust, and, let's just continue to do the good work we're doing, and we'll make it.
And Helen, when you see a government handling a crisis and it looks as if men are handling the crisis, does that send a message in some way, do you think?
Absolutely. And somebody made the point that we can't just assume things get better. And in terms of leadership, actually, on diversity issues, possibly, but on gender issues, there's so many really troubling decisions being made right now. The panel, the COP26 panel, all male, with just one example after another. And I think, again, I feel like saying, seriously, we can do so much better. And it's important that the government does. It's about the issues of legitimacy. It's about issues of equity. It's about issues of justice. It's about issues of actually effectiveness. And there's so many reasons why we have to challenge that kind of retrograde pattern that we're seeing a bit at the moment.
Well, thank you so much. Very important that we make that challenge, I think, at this conference and at Bright Blue. So I'd like to thank Bright Blue and the Centenary Action Group for organising this Springer event. Thank you so much to really great panel. I would love to carry on offline on all this. And if I could just mention that people can become a member of Bright Blue by visiting the Bright Blue website, and that there are 15 events that Bright Blue are hosting in total throughout the party conference, which will take place in this designated Bright Blue space. So thank you very much again. Thank you very much for everyone who's listening. Thanks again so much for to the panel, and stick with Bright Blue. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.